In the year 1856, in the rugged lands of northeastern Greece, a baby came into the world under the shadow of both beauty and tragedy. His name would be remembered as Mihailo Tolotos, but at the time of his birth, there was no celebration, no family gathered around, no mother to cradle him in loving arms. Within just a few hours of taking his first breath, Mihailo's mother passed away. There was no father recorded, no relative who stepped forward to claim the newborn. He began life as an orphan without a home, without family, and without even a chance to see the face of the woman who gave him life. In most places, a child in this situation might have been sent to a city orphanage or taken in by relatives or neighbors. But fate had something entirely different in store for Mihailo. Not far from where he was born was a place like no other, the peninsula of Mount Athos, a stretch of land reaching out into the Aegean Sea. Mount Athos was and still is home to one of the most isolated religious communities on Earth. For centuries, it has been a place of prayer, silence, and strict tradition. It was here that the baby was taken, into the care of the monks who lived there. They gave him food, shelter, and guidance. But they also gave him something else, a life completely removed from the outside world. Mount Athos had a rule that was more than 9 centuries old. No woman was allowed to set foot on the peninsula. This wasn't just a casual tradition. It was an unbreakable law, followed without question since the year 1060. The rule was so strict that even female animals like cows or hens were banned, with only a few exceptions like cats, which were needed control mice. For most men who came to Mount Athos as adults, this meant they left behind the world of women they had known. But for Mihailo, who had been brought there as an infant, it meant something far more extreme. He would grow up without ever seeing a woman, not even once, not as a baby, not as a boy, not as an old man. His earliest memories would have been of the monastery itself. Thick stone walls worn smooth by centuries of weather, narrow passageways that echoed with the soft sound of sandals on stone, the smell of incense drifting from the chapel, and the rhythmic chanting of prayers that marked the hours of the day. The world of Mount Athos moved at a slow and steady pace, completely separate from the rush of the outside world. There were no busy marketplaces, no carriages rattling down cobblestone streets, no voices of mothers calling children home for supper. There was only the sea, the wind of the olive trees, and the deep, calm voices of the monks as they prayed. As he grew, Mihailo learned to read and write in Greek, but the only books he knew were religious texts. He studied the Bible and the writings of early Christian saints. He learned about faith, humility, and the value of silence. He also learned practical skills, tending vegetable gardens, caring for olive trees, repairing wooden furniture, painting icons of holy men, and fishing from the rocky shores. But there was something missing from his education, though he didn't know it. He never learned the shape of a woman's face, the sound of a woman's voice, or the difference between men and women. For him, humanity was male. All the people he knew had beards, deep voices, and wore robes. All the saints and his icons were men. There were no paintings, photographs, or sculptures of women in the monastery. Even Mary, the mother of Jesus, was rarely shown in artwork there, and if she was, it was in a highly stylized and distant way that revealed nothing of a real human appearance. While Mihailo's life followed the same peaceful rhythm year after year, the outside world was changing rapidly. When he was born, there were no telephones, no electric lights, and no airplanes. Most travel was still by horse, carriage, or sailing ship. But by the time he was a teenager, steamships and railways were beginning to connect distant cities. In the late 1800s, the electric light bulb was invented, and cities began to glow at night. The telephone made it possible to speak to someone miles away. The first photographs appeared, capturing real human faces on paper. Later, moving pictures, early films, began to amaze audiences in theaters. Automobiles replaced carriages, and airplanes lifted off the ground, shrinking the world in ways people had never imagined before. But for Mihailo, these inventions were as far away as the moon. Mount Athos had no movie theaters, no train stations, no streets lit with electric lamps. The slow pace of monastic life was unchanged by these outside marvels. The monks woke before sunrise, prayed, worked in the gardens or workshops, ate simple meals, and prayed again before sleeping. They marked time not by the ticking of a clock, but by the ringing of church bells. By the time Mihailo was in his 40s, the First World War shook Europe. Nations fought with weapons more deadly than any seen before. Empires crumbled and millions of lives were lost. Yet on Mount Athos, the sea still lapped against the shore, the olive trees still bore fruit, and the monks still chanted their prayers. News of the war may have reached the monks in passing, but the events of the outside world barely touched them. As the years passed, Mihailo aged, but the world around her within Mount Athos seemed eternal. The same stone walls that had sheltered him as a baby now stood around him as an old man. The same paths he had walked as a boy were the ones he walked now, leaning perhaps on a wooden staff. He had never once stepped beyond the boundaries of the peninsula. He had never traveled to a city or seen the bustling life of a marketplace. He had never heard the laughter of a mother with her child, never witnessed a wedding, never known the sight of a young couple walking hand in hand. His life was entirely within the rhythm of prayer, work, and silence. In 1938, after 82 years of this life, Mihailo Tolotos passed away. His death was not marked by the world outside. No newspaper headlines, no speeches, no public mourning. But within the walls of Mount Athos, the monks honored him with a special funeral. They believed that he was perhaps the only man in recorded history to have lived an entire life without ever seeing a woman. It was not exile. It was not punishment. It was simply the only world he had ever known. Today, looking back on his story, it is hard to imagine such a life. In our modern world, we are surrounded by images and voices from across the globe. Even if you try to isolate yourself, technology would find its way in. Phones, televisions, and computers bring the outside world to us whether we ask for it or not. A life like Mihailo's could only exist in a place like Mount Athos, and perhaps only in a time before modern communication connected every corner of the world. Yet his story invites us to think about what it means to live fully. Mihailo may have missed experiences that most of us consider basic, but he also lived a life of purpose, devotion, and peace. He never knew the noise of the city, the rush of modern life, or the constant pull of distractions. His world was small, but it was complete to him. Mount Athos still exists today, and its rules are largely unchanged. Women are still not allowed to enter. The monasteries still keep the ancient rhythms of prayer and work. The sea still surrounds the peninsula like a protective wall, and the olive trees still shade the paths where monks walk in silence. In some ways, time has stopped there. The story of Mihailo Tolotos is not just about isolation. It is about how the place where we are born and the people who raise us can shape our entire understanding of the world. It reminds us that there are many different ways to live a human life, and that sometimes the most unusual lives can teach us the most about our own. Mihailo Tolotos' story is more than just a curiosity about a man who never saw a woman. It is a window into a completely different way of life, a life that is almost impossible for most of us to imagine. To understand his life fully, we have to understand the world of Mount Athos as it was in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the place where he lived every single day from the moment he was carried there as an infant until the day he died at 82. Mount Athos is often called the Holy Mountain. It is not a single monastery, but an entire peninsula covered with 20 monasteries and many smaller hermitages and skeets. The land itself is wild and beautiful. Steep rocky hills, dense forests of chestnut and pine, and narrow footpaths winding along cliffs that drop down to the blue waters of the Aegean Sea. In Mihailo's lifetime, there were no roads for cars, no street lamps, no marketplaces. To reach Mount Athos from the mainland, you had to take a boat. Once you arrived, you traveled on foot or by donkey along paths worn by centuries of monks. The monks of Mount Athos lived by a strict timetable. The day began long before the sun rose. Bells would ring through the dark, echoing off stone walls, calling the brothers to prayer. The church services could last for hours, the deep voices of the monks chanting in ancient Byzantine style, their words rising and falling like waves on the sea. The only light came from flickering candles and oil lamps, casting soft golden shadows across the icons on the walls. After morning prayers, the monks would have a simple meal, often just bread, olives, and a little tea or water. On some days, They might have vegetables or beans, and on feast days, perhaps fish. Meat was almost never eaten. The rest of the day was spent working. Each monk had tasks suited his abilities. Some tended the gardens and orchards, others cared for the bees and made honey, others baked bread in great stone ovens, and some copied or repaired old books in a library. In Mihailo's time, Mount Athos was one of the greatest centers of Orthodox Christian learning. The libraries held manuscripts written hundreds of years earlier. The art of icon painting was passed from one generation of monks to the next, each brushstroke carefully made according to tradition. The architecture, the music, the daily prayers, everything followed patterns that had been set centuries before Mihailo was born. Because of the ancient rule that no women could enter the peninsula, all the daily tasks that might elsewhere have been done by women, cooking, weaving, washing clothes, were done by the monks themselves. They spun wool from sheep, wove their own robes, baked their own bread, and grew their own food. Even the animals they kept for work or food were male whenever possible. Female animals were only allowed in rare cases where absolutely necessary, and they were usually kept away from the main monastic areas. For Mihailo, this was simply life as it was. He had never known anything else. When he was a small child, perhaps other boys his age in the outside world were playing in village squares, listening to their mothers tell stories, and learning about the larger world from their families. Mihailo's stories came from the Bible and from the lives of the saints. His lullabies were the chanting of evening prayers. His playground was a courtyard of the monastery, where he might help carry water from the well or gather firewood for the kitchen. He probably never even asked about women, because the concept would have been almost meaningless to him. In the outside world, children often ask questions about things they notice. Why is that person different? Who is that? But in Mihailo's world, there was nothing to spark such questions. Every person he saw was a man dressed in a black robe, with a beard, living the same life. Meanwhile, far beyond the walls of the monastery, the world was entering an era of rapid change. When Mihailo was a boy in the 1860s, Europe was still a place of empires ruled by kings and queens. The streets of big cities like London, Paris, and Athens were lit by gas lamps at night, and people traveled by horse-drawn carriage. But within his lifetime, electricity began to light the cities, telephones carried voices across long distances, and great steamships crossed oceans in days instead of weeks. The invention of the camera meant that for the first time in history, people could see real images of events and people far away. Newspapers began to include photographs. Later, the invention of cinema allowed moving pictures to show life as it happened. By the early 1900s, people could see not just their neighbors, but faraway lands, exotic animals, and yes, men and women from all over the world, simply by buying a ticket to a theater. But on Mount Athos, there were no theaters, no newspapers with photographs, and no cameras to bring the outside world in. Mihailo never saw these changes. If he heard of them at all, it was only through the rare news that reached the monks when traders or pilgrims visited. Even then, such news was treated with caution. The monks valued the peace and stability of their world, and they avoided anything that might disturb their focus on prayer and spiritual life. When Mihailo was in his 20s, Greece was going through political upheavals, wars for independence, and conflicts with the Ottoman Empire. Later, in his 60s, the First World War erupted, pulling almost every major country in Europe into a brutal conflict. Yet for Mihailo, the wars were distant echoes. He may have heard about them from a monk who traveled to the mainland for supplies, but they had no direct impact on his daily life. It is possible that in all his years, Mihailo never left the peninsula, not even for a single day. There was no reason for him to. Everything he needed was within Mount Athos. Food came from the land and the sea. Clothing was made on site, and spiritual life was centered entirely in the monasteries. The outside world was simply not part of his existence. Some might wonder what he thought about all this. Did he ever feel curiosity about what lay beyond the sea? Did he ever imagine the people who lived in faraway cities? Or was his mind so completely shaped by the life of the monastery that such thoughts never came? We cannot know for sure. But we can imagine that for a man who had never seen a woman, never walked through a busy street, never heard the sound of a child's laughter, the very idea of such things would be as strange and distant as the idea of life on another planet is to us today. When Mihailo grew old, his body may have slowed, but his life did not change. The monastery bells still rang at the same hours. The same prayers were said. The same work was done. In a world that had seen more change in his lifetime than perhaps any previous century, Mihailo's life was one of complete constancy. In 1938, he died at the age of 82. The monks buried him with respect, honoring him for a life lived entirely within the traditions of Mount Athos. They believed, and it is quite possible, that he was the only man in recorded history to live a full lifetime without ever seeing a woman. To the monks, this was not a sad fact, but a remarkable one, a testament to the purity and dedication of monastic life. For us today, his life can seem almost unbelievable. We live in a world where the boundaries between public and private life are thin, where images, sounds, and stories from across the globe reach us in seconds. Even people in remote areas carry mobile phones that can connect them to anyone, anywhere. The idea of spending 82 years without ever seeing half the human race feels impossible. But in Mihailo's time, in the cloistered world of Mount Athos, it was not only possible, it was a reality from birth to death. His story raises questions that are worth thinking about. What does it mean to live a full life? Is it defined by the variety of experiences we have, or by the depth of commitment we bring to the life we choose? Mihailo never traveled the world, never saw great cities, never knew romantic love, never had a family. But he lived with purpose, following the traditions and rules of his community. Perhaps for him, that was enough. Mount Athos still stands today, and though some things have changed, a few monks now use the internet to share religious teachings, and boats with engines have replaced the old sailing vessels. The heart of life there remains the same. Women are still not allowed to enter. The ancient chants still fill the air, and the stone walls still watch over the lives of men who have chosen this path. Somewhere on its quiet paths, under the shade of the olive trees, one can imagine the footsteps of Mihailo Tolotos, the man who lived and died in a world without women.